So once again, thanks everyone for joining us today. We will now begin the webinar. The webinar is being hosted by the IA Population Issues Working Group. It will be related to the paper produced by the working group called Interaction Between Pensions and Housing, which will be presented by Martin Stevenson, who is co-vice chair of the working group. I will now, and let me just mention as well that the Q&A panel on your screen allows you to submit questions for Martin, and you will be able to submit those questions during the webinar, and we will address them once we get to the end. I now hand over to Martin Stevenson, who will be doing this presentation.
Thanks very much, Christian, for that introduction. Look, thanks everyone who's on the webinar for joining us. I think the times range from about 7 in the morning on the East Coast in America, must cut into the working day during for people in Europe, and for people at the other end of the spectrum like myself, it's 11 o'clock at night. So appreciate people giving up their time, whatever that time happens to be. If we move to the next slide. Christian? Yeah, so as everyone on the webinar would be well aware, actuaries are heavily involved in retirement income systems and in pension schemes. And the ultimate aim of those schemes or the pension funds is to provide people with an adequate standard of living. And yet, in many circumstances, home ownership is an absolutely critical element for attaining an adequate income in retirement, and yet actuarial involvement in housing is relatively rare. So this paper, which, as Christian says, has been prepared by the Population Issues Working Group, looks at the interaction between pensions and housing and goes through a number of examples where by looking at housing and pensions together, there can be favourable outcomes for both the working population and retirees. And it's also hoped that consideration of pensions and housing together may lead to an expansion of actuarial work. Next slide, thanks. So the webinar will proceed with, firstly, a very high-level overview of retirement income systems, where the main point is that they are currently under stress. We then look at the importance and the financial significance of housing. The next part is to look at trends in housing, in particular at a couple of trends in a number of countries that are a bit disturbing, such as a decrease in home ownership in a number of countries, and also house prices increasing at a much higher rate than wages. There are then 4 examples of interaction between housing and pensions. Firstly, looking at reverse mortgages or other ways of accessing equity in the home. Then virtually the reverse of that, looking how in some circumstances use of pension balances to assist people in housing would make sense. The third one is mortgage disintermediation, or how pension funds can assist people obtaining homes. And then I look at a particular instance, Singapore, where there is a complete interaction between housing and pensions. Yeah, next slide. So in very broad terms, the objectives of retirement income systems are to provide a comfortable or adequate standard of living in retirement. And broadly, well, there's a number of ways of describing retirement income systems, but a common one is to look at it in having 3 pillars. The first one being social security, which would be a state-run universal pension system, which offers basic coverage generally, i.e. it's poverty alleviation. And this pillar is generally unfunded. The second pillar in this categorisation is funded or partially funded mandatory schemes, and these can be state or occupational, can be defined benefit or defined contribution. And Pillar 3 is other financial assets that can be used to fund retirement, including voluntary occupational plans, also including individual savings plans, and generally this Pillar 3 is funded. Next slide, thanks. So, as I said, at the highest level, currently there are pressures on the three pillars. As I mentioned, a number of the pillars are either unfunded or partially funded, and there's two causes of stress for these unfunded arrangements. One is the decrease in fertility that has been happening over, well, at least the last 50 or 60 years, because as fertility reduces, so does the number of workers coming into the system reduce. Another factor that affects unfunded schemes has been the increased longevity of the old, again increasing the number of people in the non-working population compared to the working population. And these two factors have combined to increase the old age dependency ratio. This dependency ratio is often expressed as the percentage of those aged 65 per 100 people to those aged between the ages of 15 and 65. So it's this increase in the old age dependency ratio that has adverse effects on unfunded arrangements. As far as the funded arrangements are concerned, there are two unfavourable factors as well. One is the increase in longevity, which means that the working population or the funds accumulated either in DB or DC have to support a higher benefit payment. And the other stress on funded plans have been the low interest rate environment, which we've had since the global financial crisis. And whilst in the short term asset prices, certain asset prices have increased, there certainly is a very uncertain economic future. So, as I said, a very quick overview of retirement income systems, and broadly there are stresses on these systems. If we now move to housing, the first point I'd like to make is the absolute critical importance of housing to people's well-being. And the quote from the Australian Productivity Commission, which is given there, I think sums it up very well, and I will quote from it. The Commission stated that access to affordable and quality housing is central to community well-being. Apart from meeting the basic need for shelter, it provides a foundation for family and social stability and contributes to improved health and educational outcomes and a productive workforce. Thus, it enhances both economic performance and social capital. And in the paper that we produced, there is an example of where we quantify the effect of owning a home for people in retirement. The peak pensions industry body in Australia estimates how much people need to have a comfortable standard of living. It is, of course, subjective what that comfortable standard is, but it is a measure that is widespread used in Australia. And for a single person who owns a home, this peak body estimates that a single person would need 545,000 Australian dollars for a comfortable standard of living. But that's obviously spread as an income. However, for a person who rents, In Sydney, the required amount is 1,045,000, so sort of nearly twice as much. Next slide, thanks. Another aspect of housing is how financially significant it is. The first three countries that we consider there, Australia, Singapore and the UK, the wealth in housing exceeds the wealth in pension assets quite comfortably. That's not the case in the USA, but even so, housing wealth is very significant when compared to pension assets. Next slide, thanks. The purpose of this next slide, and there's also examples given for Australia in the paper, is just to make a point that this paper relates to part of the population and not the entire population. For people in the first quintile of wealth, or and that's the lowest quintile than what we're using, they are going to be dependent upon the state in retirement in some form or another. The fifth quintile, or the wealthiest, generally have enough wealth in pensions and or housing and other forms that they can look after themselves. But it's really that group, the second, the fourth quintile, which is still obviously a very, very large part of the population. The consideration of pensions and housing looked at together can make sense. Okay, next slide, thanks. Yeah, I think this slide could be the subject of a paper all by itself, but the purpose of this slide is just showing the extent of home ownership in countries around the world. And the point again here is the great importance of housing, the high proportion of home ownership that is enjoyed in most of the countries shown here. What intrigues me most about this table, and I haven't investigated further, but is that countries that are generally associated with being wealthy have a relatively low level of home ownership. So if you look at the Netherlands or Australia or Canada on this slide, USA and UK, the level of home ownership is not as large as countries that are not seen as so wealthy, such as Romania or Macedonia or Croatia. But as I said, for the purposes of the paper, the important point is how widespread home ownership is and how important it is for people. Next slide, thanks. Now, as I mentioned at the start, there are, however, in some countries, some trends, some what I think are some disturbing trends, and one of them is the way that home ownership is declining. This is certainly true of my country, Australia, where in 1981, 61% of people aged 25 to 34 owned their own home, and this is now reduced to just 45%. For people who are at the retirement age now, or for people who have retired, home ownership is a very satisfactory 80%, but this is projected to fall to 55% by the middle of the century. Next slide, thanks. And this trend of declining home ownership amongst the young is something that is widespread in a number of countries. We looked at New Zealand, and if you look at the two youngest age groups there, there's a significant decline in home ownership in the 25 to 29-year-old group, and also the 30 to 34-year-old group. In the UK, the same pattern has occurred. In the 25 to 34-year group, home ownership declined from 56% in 2005-6 to 36% in 2015-16. Next slide, thanks. Similarly, similar pattern in Israel, again, where there is decrease in the percentage of home ownership between this time 1997 and 2012, again in the youngest age groups. Next slide, thanks. In America, a slightly different feature. Whilst home ownership has declined a little bit, it's not to as marked extent as the other countries are looking at. But what is more marked is the number of people who have paid off their home, and that the number of people with a mortgage has increased quite significantly, as can be seen from the graph that, say, for people over 65 between 1983 and 2013, the percentage who owned a home only declined from 74.6 to 72, but the percentage of homes owned outright declined from 64.9 and 47.7. So these trends are potentially worrying. I think in Australia there certainly is a lot of soul searching about whether there will be cultural change through the declining home ownership. Next slide, thanks. However, just to round out the picture, this trend of declining home ownership is certainly not universal around the world. In Singapore, it's been fairly steady, and in Canada, home ownership rates have actually increased over the period that we looked at. Next slide, thanks. The other trend that's noticeable and might partially be an explanation for why home ownership is declining. The other trend has been in the 5 years that we looked at from 2012 to 2017 has been the very rapid increase in home prices compared to wages. With the 5 countries that we looked at there, Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, UK and USA, in all cases you can see that the level of increase in home prices has greatly outstripped the level of increase in wages. And in some cases, there's been even more extreme examples. If you look at Canada, whilst overall over the last 5 years, house prices have increased by 48% compared to wages of about 9% over that period. In Vancouver, prices have actually increased by 76%, and Sydney is also a similar hotspot. Now, it is true that since 2017, in some countries, prices have come off from these large increases, but even so, the sort of diminution in house prices has been quite low, and the fact remains that the increase in home prices has greatly outstripped wages. Next slide, thanks. So what the next thing I want to talk about is how perhaps looking at pensions and housing together, some of the shortfalls in one or the other can be remedied or mitigated anyway. So it's certainly the case that many retirees, for whatever reason, have inadequate retirement income that have very large financial equity in their home. An obvious course of action is to release part of this equity for increasing post-retirement income. And one possible release method is a reverse mortgage, termed equity release in some countries, or home equity conversion mortgage in others. Next slide, thanks. So let's look a little bit more closely at features of reverse mortgages. What it does, it allows an individual to borrow against the value of his or her home, and the loan accumulates with interest and is repaid from the proceeds of the sale on termination. This clearly is only going to work for people above a certain age, because obviously the younger someone is, the longer they're likely to live, and the amount that could be borrowed would be too low to make a meaningful difference. Traditionally, payments from a reverse mortgage are made as a lump sum, and there are developments that to make payments rather than as a lump sum, to make them as income payments to supplement a retirement income. And certainly, if used this way, as a reverse mortgage, applying as a pension, well, as a series of payments rather than as a lump sum, can help people meaningfully increase their income in retirement. Next slide, thanks. Just a few other aspects of reverse mortgage. These days, a no negative equity guarantee is generally applied. What that means is that the total payment at the end, the repayment of the debt, cannot be higher than the proceeds of the home. Obviously, something like a reverse mortgage is it's a complex financial instrument in itself, but it also has generational implications, and so one wouldn't be contemplated without education about them, legal advice and financial advice, and in particular the tax and social security implications have to be looked at, because sometimes owning a house, or often owning a house, has different tax and social security implications to receiving some money. Next slide, thanks. However, reverse mortgages have certainly not been popular in the past and in the present, as I'll come to. People naturally have an aversion to debt, and with a pension fund that I'm associated with, where we're looking at the possibility of offering reverse mortgages to help people. We did a survey of some of our members, and those people aged, say, perhaps 45 to 55, just wouldn't be interested at all in a reverse mortgage. They've spent many years trying to pay down the debt on their home, and the last thing they would want is to increase that debt again. However, when we spoke to people who were already retired, 65-year-olds or 70-year-olds, the story was a bit different. But whilst there still was that aversion to debt, there was the feeling that, in many cases it did solve some financial issues that they had, and they were much more receptive to the idea. Other barriers to reverse mortgages, including that there have been some perhaps unfortunate aspects of them in the past. this such as the debt exceeding home equity, and in some cases premature foreclosures on people. People obviously want to preserve home equity for long-term care provisions or to leave a bequest, and there's the worry about the cost of debt. Where's it sort of all going to end? And some of those disadvantages also apply to the providers of reverse mortgages. They've got the uncertainty of longevity and, based on the past, perhaps some reputational risk. Next slide, thanks. And the statistics from around the world really bear out what I've been saying about the non-acceptability of them. In the countries we looked at, Australia, USA, the penetration is less than 2% of eligible households. In the US, there was a study which suggested that logically the market could perhaps extend to 12 to 14% of households. Canada have reverse mortgages, but again have not been taken up seriously, except for the last few years, and from a low base, there has been a significant increase recently. Next slide, thanks. I'll talk about Singapore later as a special case, and the UK situation is a little bit like Canada's, again, relatively low penetration, but there has been, from a low base, quite a large increase recently. And certainly, I think from the factors that are discussed before, that house prices have increased markedly in a number of geographies, meaning that housing equity now, in many instances, greatly exceeds pension assets. I think that right now there is potentially a sweet spot for reverse mortgages. There is an example in the paper where, and a fairly realistic example, where a retiree effects a reverse mortgage, enabling him or her to material increase his standard of living in retirement, but still has sufficient leftover home equity remaining for aged care accommodation or a bequest. Next slide, thanks. There are other means of accessing home equity, but these, one of which is downsizing. The bigger disadvantage of downsizing is generally that means moving out of the home that one has lived in, and in many cases people feel enormous attachment to it. And the other potential disadvantage is it means moving to a different area, which means moving away from the community that the person has been living in. Another means of accessing home equity, but it's even less common than reverse mortgages, is the sale of a reversionary interest in the home. So what that means is that someone might sell, say, 30% of their home to a provider and gets paid an amount up front for that. The advantage is the person knows that no matter what, they will still retain 70% of the equity on sale. They don't have to worry about the effects of interest rate eating too much into the equity of the home. Next slide, please. So the second example of interaction is kind of the reverse of what we've just been talking about. That for older people, they've got the high house equity and insufficient retirement income. For many young people, the problem is with the rapid increase in home prices and with wages not increasing particularly rapidly, it's very difficult for them to get into the housing market. And as we've seen, home ownership has declined drastically in a number of areas. So, particularly for defined contribution funds, it can make sense for members of pension funds to utilise their pension balances to assist in purchasing a home by raising part of the home deposit. And I certainly believe that if utilising a pension fund balance in the early years can make the difference between a person being able to purchase a home rather than missing out, then the application of the balance in this way can improve the person's retirement outcome compared to retaining the balance in the fund to accumulate to retirement. I've got to say this is not without controversy, this view. A number of people will say, well, a pension fund is just for pension purposes. But it's my contention that housing is so important, and if there's a real issue there, that it can, in some circumstances, be advantageous to use pension balances to help people move into a home. Next slide, thanks. Again, a move like this has to be carefully thought through. One has to balance the reduction in retirement benefit against home ownership. There is an argument that if pension monies are used for home purchase, all that will do will increase house prices. I don't really think that's a major effect. There's been many booms in house prices that have nothing to do with people having, for new home buyers, having access to capital. Certainly any arrangement that we've talked about should only be for first home occupiers. The whole purpose is to help people get into the housing market. And limits should be placed on amounts to be withdrawn to prevent too great a reduction in a retirement benefit. And again, this is complex and has many issues, so education and financial advice and consideration of tax and social security is very important. Next slide, thanks. And just a brief summary of what's happening around some parts of the world. Singapore I'll deal with later. In New Zealand has a sort of mandatory defined contribution fund called KiwiSaver. Balances can be used for financing a first home. Australia very recently passed legislation to allow some contributions capped to finance the first home. I'm not aware of any provision in the USA. There is in the UK individual savings accounts, which can be used. Again, there are restrictions, but can be used for homes. And in Canada, first home buyers may borrow up to $25,000, and that's borrowing, that's not sort of using the funds. They have to be repaid. And in the paper, we consider a particular example where a person withdraws his or her accumulation balance after 6 years of membership in a defined contribution fund and uses it to buy a home. In this example, which is fairly realistic, I believe, the end result of a home and slightly reduced pension balance is clearly superior to no home and at a higher pension balance. Next, thanks. The third example is what I've called mortgage disintermediation, and this is simply the pension funds being a provider of mortgage finance, so assisting perhaps members of the funds with both the availability of finance and potentially at a lower rate than might otherwise be the case. This lower rate, in theory, is possible because the bank margins can be eliminated, and also the possibility that existing providers have more got legacy systems. This investment in mortgages would be in lieu of current fixed interest assets, so there's no need for the pension fund to really change its overall mix of assets. And clearly, I don't think any pension funds would do it by themselves. They need to have access to expertise and efficient IT systems. Next slide, please. And there is an example of that working at the moment. That's in the Netherlands, and please forgive my pronunciation. An organisation called Munt Hypotheken does originate mortgages through 1,700 mortgage brokers, and it's done through a Dutch mortgage fund which invests in the mortgages on behalf of 11 pension funds. It's only a fairly recent development, with mortgages being written from 2014, but already $12 billion euro residential mortgages have now been originated. Next one, thanks. The final example I give is Singapore, where there really is integration between their housing policies and the Central Provident Fund. So Singapore has three pillars of housing: a housing development board, a land acquisition act, and their Central Provident Fund. The Land Acquisition Act gave the state broad powers to acquire land, and as you can see on the slide, the proportion of land that's been owned this way has rapidly increased, a lot of which has just been done on reclaimed land. And the amounts are significant, and net proceeds from land sales have been moved into government reserves, now estimated at 2.5 times GDP. Next slide, thanks. So the HDB was set up to provide decent homes equipped with modern amenities for all those who need them, and it offers homes on a 99-year lease basis. But the linchpin of the arrangement and where pensions and housing come together is that the Central Provident Fund monies are actively used for people to purchase homes. And as you can see on the slide, whilst it's called a Central Provident Fund, over 50% of payments are actually made for people who provide housing. Next slide, thanks. Another feature of the Singapore approach is to have higher taxes on people who can afford it, or who are seen to be able to afford it, such as foreigners, and quite large subsidies for those who are in need. Next slide, thanks. And a still further measure has been to prevent home prices rocketing, so that the government does intervene through ban on market transactions, imposing an income ceiling and capital gains tax to ensure, from time to time, to ensure that prices don't skyrocket. There is a form of monetising housing. As I mentioned, the houses aren't sold outright. It's a 99-year lease. And what people can do is monetise part of the lease. So they might say, all right, I'll keep it for 60 years, but can sell the last 39 years of the lease. There is actually a means of monetising it. Next slide, thanks. So I think Singapore is an example that I suspect no other country will follow, because it is such a tightly controlled. It is the state dictating so much what can be done. But what they've achieved is pretty remarkable, sort of looking at housing and working with the Central Provident Fund to assist that. Pension savings have been mobilised for housing. Housing assets can be monetised. The whole program started in 1970 with 29% home ownership, and that's now moved to 90%. And housing prices have been kept at reasonable levels. Another feature is it's even been used to assist racial integration, because it's not possible to sell houses to ethnic groups if already within the area that ethnic group predominates, so they avoid ghettos. So I'm not putting forward as something that people will follow, but I think it does show that when pensions and housing are put together, there can be some pretty remarkable results. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so really just finally to summarise what I've been saying before, I really would think that it's advantageous for actuaries who are involved in various ways in advising governments or pension funds or in financial planning, if housing could be taken more into account along with pensions, which we're so familiar with. And I just make the point that, I've given a number of examples which depend upon the current or economic conditions or current trends. These will change in the future. For example, price increases are already tapering off. But I believe that even as economic conditions change, there's still likely to be better outcomes made if one looks at housing and pensions together rather than as two silos. So thank you again for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Martin. So as I mentioned earlier, we are now ready for our question and answer period. So I will ask all of our participants now to submit their questions via the Q&A panel that you find on your screen. Please go ahead whenever you're ready to submit your questions, and we'll just take them in order. I do have one question, Martin, to start off with. You outlined 4 different interactions in the paper and during the webinar today. Are you aware of any other interactions which didn't make it into the paper?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Christian. Yeah. Just one thing to point out. We only wanted to include in the paper interactions where there were concrete examples to show, that they weren't just theoretical concepts that were actually in place. But there is another concept which I think is quite interesting, but since not aware of it being applied in practice around the world, it wasn't included. And this is the one that relates to the issue of rapid increase in housing, making it very difficult for people to purchase a home. And it particularly applies to people who have sort of little choice in geography. By that I mean people like teachers and policemen who maybe have their school or the police unit in areas which are quite expensive. So they are confronted with the choice that the only affordable homes that they could get might be ones that are 40 or 50 kilometres away from where they work, which is not satisfactory. So a solution being proposed for that is to have institutions and funding would be provided by pension funds to purchase, say, half a home with the person affected, so that, say, a teacher could afford a $400,000 home, as I say, 20 or 30 kilometres away from work. That teacher could take half a stake in a, say, $800,000 home near to the place of work. and the financial institution would take up the other half. And of course, obviously you have to work out exactly the way that the finances flow through. So I have seen some, what I think are fairly well thought out proposals along these lines, but haven't seen it applied in practice yet.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for that. We don't have any other questions right now that have been submitted, so I'm not sure where you want to go at this point. We'd like to stay on the line maybe another few minutes and hope that we do get some questions from our participants. So please go ahead and type those questions out, and we'll be ready to answer them. And let me remind everyone that if you have not had a chance to look at the paper, it is available on the IAA website. So if you navigate to the publications page or publication sections and hit our papers page, the paper is listed there. And actually, following the webinar today, we will post as well the link to this recording. So that you'll be able to access it afterwards, or you can share that with your colleagues if you wish. No, I don't have anything that has come up. I'm not sure, Martin, if you have anything else you wish to add at this point, in hoping that some questions do come.
Not really. Yeah, I've got to say I've been on a few webinars as an attendee, not a panelist. It's not all that surprising for some reason that there aren't questions. So, I mean,
okay, well, we are about 10 minutes short of our end time, but we will, I guess, we will close it off now. I guess we don't have any questions, but if anyone does come up with any questions afterwards, feel free to submit those to myself at the IAA. My name is Christian Levac, so you can find my email on the website. And if you do have any questions that come up, I will surely relay those to Martin and the Population Issues Working Group. So that's about it. We're going to close off the webinar now, and thank you everyone for your participation.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks everyone for joining.